The morning air inside the airport felt too clean, too polished, like it was hiding something. People moved with quiet purpose, each lost in their own destinations. Yet beneath that hum of order, there was a fracture forming. Daniel stood at the front of the VIP line, his confidence polished like his shoes. He adjusted his cufflinks with the kind of entitlement that doesn't need to speak to be heard. Just behind him stood Elias, calm, still, and waiting for a space that never seemed to open. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His authority came from years of being treated as if the world existed for his convenience. "You're in the wrong line," he murmured without even looking up. Elias didn't flinch. He simply replied, "I'm where my ticket says I belong." The woman behind the counter hesitated, not because she doubted him, but because the room suddenly carried the weight of centuries. Daniel's smirk was small but sharp. "Let's not make this uncomfortable," he said. But the discomfort had already begun. It lived in the silence that followed. The attendant's fingers trembled slightly as she took Elias's ID. Her eyes widened as she read his name. The same name etched across the company's headquarters. The man who signed her paychecks. Elias didn't boast. He didn't correct. He simply said, "No rush. I'm patient." The words sank like a quiet storm. Around them, whispers started. A woman pretending to scroll, a man pausing mid-stride. Something unseen shifted. The hierarchy that once felt permanent began to tremble. When the attendant finally spoke, her voice cracked under the weight of realization. "Mr. Grant, your seat awaits." And just like that, Daniel's silence became his downfall. The air around the counter grew colder. Daniel's polite grin stretched into something sharper, something that asked for control without ever needing to demand it. "Didn't think they'd start letting anyone up here," he muttered, voice smooth enough to pass for humor. The attendant's laugh was nervous, too quick, too small. Elias's eyes stayed steady, unflinching, like someone who'd seen this scene 1,000 times before. "I believe my name's already on the list," Elias said quietly. The attendant looked between them. One man used to being obeyed, the other used to being questioned. Her hesitation wasn't personal. It was practiced, passed down through years of unspoken training. Daniel leaned forward, resting his hand on the counter. "Let's not hold up the line, all right?" For a second, silence stood taller than both of them. Elias didn't blink. "You seem in a hurry," he replied. His tone wasn't sharp, but it was calm, heavy with meaning. "Some of us have been waiting a little longer than you realize." Daniel smirked, that easy smirk born from centuries of comfort. "Guess patience comes naturally to some," he said, his words sliding like ice. Elias's lips curved slightly, not a smile, not quite. "Patience," he murmured, "or survival." The words landed softly, but their echo cracked through the air. The attendant froze, eyes flicking down to the screen as recognition hit her like a delayed confession. "Mr. Grant," she stammered. I didn't realize." Daniel's posture faltered, confusion flickering where arrogance once lived. Elias just nodded. Most don't. His calm was disarming, a dignity that didn't ask to be seen but demanded it nonetheless. As Elias walked past, Daniel turned away, pretending to scroll his phone. But his reflection on the polished counter betrayed him, smiling still, though this time it looked a lot like shame. Daniel adjusted his jacket as if the fabric itself confirmed his place in the world. He stepped forward when the gate opened, not because he was called, but because he always had been. The attendant didn't stop him. No one ever did. Behind him, Elias waited. Not out of hesitation, but out of habit. The learned patience of a man who had seen this play unfold too many times to count. The hum of cameras, the shuffle of feet, the soft announcement over the intercom, all blended into one long sigh of quiet complicity. Daniel turned slightly, offering Elias a glance that said everything words could not. "You can go after me," he murmured, not looking back long enough to see the weight of his own arrogance. Elias didn't reply. He simply stepped forward, slow, deliberate, his eyes steady on the gate. The attendant's voice trembled faintly. "Sir, She didn't finish. Elias gave a small nod, the kind that ends a conversation before it begins. "It's fine," he said softly. But it wasn't. It never was. Daniel paused just ahead, noticing the silence behind him. "Everything all right?" His tone carried mock concern, the kind that hides mockery behind manners. Elias met his eyes for the first time. "Perfectly," he said. His voice was calm, but beneath it lived years of swallowed storms. The gate beeped green. Elias walked through, his stride even unbroken. Daniel stayed behind for a second too long, unsure why his chest tightened at the sight of quiet composure walking past him. As Elias disappeared down the jet bridge, Daniel exhaled, a breath caught between superiority and unease. Around them, the world kept moving, unaware that power had just shifted hands. Quietly, irrevocably, Daniel swirled the champagne in his glass, watching the bubbles rise like little reminders of the world he thought he controlled. The engines hummed beneath the cabin, steady and indifferent. He leaned back, letting a small smirk play at his lips, certain that his presence alone was enough to command attention. Elias sat across the aisle, fingers loosely folded, eyes tracing the ever-shifting clouds outside the window. He didn't glance at Daniel, but he felt the tension that clung to the air, heavy, expectant, like it was waiting for something inevitable to unfold. "You always fly first class?" Daniel asked, voice casual, a blade hidden in civility. Elias looked at him briefly, not with anger, but with quiet assessment. "Only when necessary," he replied, then returned to the clouds. Daniel laughed softly, a sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Necessary, huh? Must be nice to have everything handed to you." Elias didn't respond. Silence stretched, thick enough to make Daniel shift in his seat. He wasn't used to this. A lack of reaction felt like an insult, though nothing had been said. A flight attendant passed by, offering a nervous smile, and Daniel noticed her gaze linger on Elias just a second too long. His brow furrowed. "What's with all the staring?" "Observation," Elias said simply. Nothing more. The rest of the cabin moved in quiet rhythm, headphones on, papers shuffled, screens glowing. Outside, the sun reflected off the clouds, indifferent to the fragile hierarchies below. Daniel took another sip and realized, slowly, that his small victories on the ground meant nothing up here. Elias's calm was a mirror he didn't want to look into, yet couldn't avoid. By the time they leveled off, Daniel felt it, the first ripple of consequence, silent but undeniable. Pride had a price, and the ledger was already being written. Daniel tapped the armrest with a precise rhythm, as if the seat itself belonged to him, not the ticket in Elias's hand. "You know, this is my spot," he said softly, voice laced with expectation, almost a challenge. The flight attendant glanced at him nervously, caught between procedure and the weight of his unspoken authority. "I'm afraid this seat is assigned," Elias replied, calm, almost detached. His tone didn't invite argument, but it didn't yield either. Daniel's eyes narrowed, not used to resistance without confrontation. "Assigned?" he repeated, voice low, almost tasting disbelief. "I've flown this route dozens of times. You can't tell me where I sit." Elias leaned back slightly, shoulders even, hands resting loosely on his lap. "I can only follow what's on the boarding pass." No apology, no correction, just simple, unshakable truth. Daniel let out a faint laugh, a sound meant to dismiss but failing under the weight of quiet defiance. The attendant shifted uneasily. "Sir, if you could, maybe take the next available seat?" Her words trembled slightly. The cabin's hum seemed to amplify her discomfort. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I don't think you understand," he said, sharp enough to slice silence. "This isn't negotiable." Elias's gaze met his for a single, steady beat. "Everything can be negotiated," he replied softly. "But dignity isn't one of them." The words landed quietly, yet the air seemed to tense, passengers glancing discreetly toward the exchange, uncomfortable with the authority unraveling before them. Daniel exhaled slowly, realizing his dominance had lost shape. He swirled the champagne in his glass, pretending detachment, but his hand betrayed him with a subtle tremor. Elias didn't move, didn't smile, didn't react, the calm assertion of presence doing more damage than any raised voice could. The cabin returned to its low murmur, but nothing felt the same. A single seat, quietly claimed, became a mirror reflecting a history Daniel could no longer control. Daniel leaned back in his seat, swirling the half-empty glass of champagne. "You know," he said, voice low, "some doors just open for the right people. Connections, influence, money." His eyes flicked toward Elias, expecting recognition, admiration, maybe envy. Elias didn't turn. He watched the clouds, letting the hum of the engines fill the space between them. "Doors open," he said finally, voice calm, "but some doors you build yourself." Daniel laughed, soft and dismissive. "Some of us don't have the time to wait for construction. We take what's ours." "You think taking it changes anything," Elias replied almost under his breath, "when respect never comes with it?" The words barely carried across the aisle, but the weight settled like fog. Daniel frowned, a flash of irritation breaking his practiced ease. "Respect? You mean fear. People respect what they can't touch." Elias turned slightly, just enough for Daniel to see the quiet intensity in his eyes. "Fear isn't respect. It's avoidance, and it always comes back to haunt you." The flight attendant passed by, careful not to linger, but Elias noticed her eyes. Hesitation. Recognition. The subtle shifts in the cabin that Daniel could not yet read. Daniel's smile tightened. "You always so philosophical? Even in the air?" "I've learned to listen," Elias said. "Silence teaches more than shouting ever could." Daniel exhaled, sensing a tension he hadn't expected. The arrogance that usually shielded him felt porous, a thin veneer under the weight of subtle truth. He took another sip, but the taste no longer comforted. Outside, clouds drifted in perfect indifference. Inside, the seat between them became more than a chair. It was a space where history, power, and patience converged. For Elias, every moment of quiet was a measured strike. For Daniel, each second felt like a door closing he hadn't noticed was ajar. The junior flight attendant hovered near the galley, voice barely audible. "Sir, that passenger, he's Elias Reed, CEO of Reed Dynamics." Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the service tablet, eyes darting toward the cockpit. The captain froze mid-adjustment, fingers resting on the controls. His eyes widened just enough for Elias, seated nearby, to remain undisturbed. Recognition dawned slowly. Regret flickered. Years of dismissals, small slights, casual nods to ego, all colliding in a single heartbeat. Daniel, oblivious, continued recounting his recent deals. "And then I told them exactly what they needed. Connections like mine you can't teach. It's all about leverage." He gestured toward Elias casually, unaware of the storm gathering in silent acknowledgement. Elias shifted slightly, letting the weight of presence fill the space. "Leverage," he murmured softly to himself, "only matters if you understand who holds the foundation." Daniel leaned back, smirking. "I've built networks, people bending over backward to please me. You know what that's like?" His gaze flickered toward Elias, expecting reaction, admiration, or envy. Nothing came. Silence. The flight attendant swallowed, lips pressed tight, and whispered again. "Sir, he controls the software systems your division just signed for. He could cancel the entire contract." Daniel blinked, confusion briefly breaking his composure. "What do you mean?" Elias's voice was calm, measured, almost distant. "You've been discussing my company's plans as if they don't touch your life." "They do." Daniel shifted, unease creeping in. His confident smirk faltered. The realization that arrogance carries consequences settled in quietly, heavier than any confrontation could have delivered. Passengers remained unaware. Headphones on, eyes closed, yet a subtle shift rippled through the cabin. Power had changed altitude, unseen, undeniable, and irreversible. The glass tipped over with a soft clink, spilling amber liquid across Daniel's polished armrest. He barely flinched, voice rising like a storm, sharp and deliberate. I don't care who you are. First class isn't for people who don't know their place. Passengers shifted uneasily, some avoiding his gaze, others clutching devices quietly. A young man in the aisle reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against a phone. The red recording dot blinked on, unnoticed by most, but it marked the moment that arrogance would be documented forever. Elias, seated upright, calm as marble, glanced toward the disturbance. "Let him have his moment," he said softly, voice carrying weight, unshakable. No tremor, no anger, only quiet authority. Daniel turned, noticing the faint attention, frustration furrowing his brow. "What did you say?" he snapped. Elias's gaze didn't waver. "I said let him have it." Sometimes silence speaks louder than any rebuttal. The cabin remained still. A flight attendant hovered, unsure whether to intervene. The tension was palpable, like air before a storm, dense and heavy. Daniel's words grew erratic. "You think I'm scared? You think you—" He paused mid-sentence, realizing the camera on the phone, the glint in the passenger's eye, the documentation of every misstep. Elias's lips curved slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging the unfolding justice. "Your fear isn't my concern. Your choices are," he replied, measured, deliberate. The young passenger's recording captured every syllable, every inflection, the rise and collapse of entitlement. Daniel's face flickered with sudden understanding, the room shrinking around his pride. The plane hummed steadily above the clouds, a silent observer. Power had shifted quietly, irrevocably. What seemed like a trivial altercation had become evidence, and Elias's restraint had turned the ordinary into history. The cabin exhaled collectively, though silently. Justice had arrived in the stillness, unnoticed yet undeniable. The airport terminal pulsed with motion, but every screen seemed to pause on Daniel's face. His voice, sharp and entitled, filled the clip now circulating endlessly. People scrolled, fingers swiping past, shaking their heads, whispering to companions. Daniel's grin, once so confident, cracked with each replay. A young woman in a coffee line murmured, "I can't believe he said that." Her friend nodded, eyes wide, phone held high, recording, sharing, commenting. Social media became the verdict, public opinion the jury, and Daniel hadn't even realized the trial had begun. He stepped forward, suitcase in hand, but hesitation weighed on him. A colleague passed, avoided his eyes. "You okay?" they asked, voice small. Daniel forced a smile, stiff and unconvincing. "Yeah, fine." But the words fell flat, hollow echoes in a hall now filled with judgment. Elias moved silently through the crowd, observing the subtle shifts, passengers lowering their devices when he passed, whispers fading to a reverent hush. His calm aura wasn't arrogance, it was quiet affirmation. The power dynamics of hours ago had inverted, and every silent acknowledgement from bystanders amplified it. A manager approached Daniel, phone in hand. "Sir, this is trending fast. Maybe a statement?" Daniel swallowed, lips dry. No statement. I can handle it." The words trembled, unconvincing even to himself. Elias glanced briefly at the unfolding chaos, a shadow of satisfaction in his measured steps. Truth, he thought, doesn't need loud declarations. It moves quietly, steadily, and it arrives unannounced. Daniel's reflection glared back from a polished kiosk screen, eyes wide, forced grin fading further. He realized that applause could vanish in seconds, that silence from the right quarters spoke louder than any defense. The room had shifted. The arrogant voice was drowned, and dignity had reclaimed the floor without uttering a word. The terminal carried on, indifferent yet attentive, as Daniel's empire of entitlement began to crumble quietly under the weight of its own reflection. Daniel stepped into the boardroom, the polished floor reflecting fluorescent lights and his own unease. He cleared his throat, glancing at the row of executives seated around the table. Some avoided his gaze entirely. Others watched cautiously, aware that the narrative had already shifted outside these walls. "Mr. Cross," Elias began, voice even, measured. "Thank you for coming." He gestured toward the chair at the head of the table. Daniel hesitated, looking around for support, but found only quiet scrutiny. I thought we could discuss the proposal," Daniel stammered, attempting a confident smile that faltered immediately. Elias nodded once, slowly. "We reviewed it. Your consulting division will no longer be part of our vendor network." The room was silent, but the statement carried the weight of inevitability. Daniel's lips parted, seeking words, but none came. "Is there a reason?" he asked, voice low, almost pleading. "Mr. Cross," Elias said softly, "you don't lose everything in a day. You simply witness what dignity costs when arrogance overshadows judgment." He leaned back, composed. "We cannot work with those who elevate entitlement over ethics." Daniel's hands clenched the tabletop. I didn't," he broke off, swallowing. Silence, thick and tense, replaced his words. Every executive around the table shifted slightly, some nodding imperceptibly, some staring blankly at documents, all acknowledging the quiet authority Elias carried. "I understand," Daniel finally muttered, voice breaking. I'll leave." He stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor, eyes flicking briefly to the closed doors behind him. Elias watched without expression, allowing the moment to land fully. The room absorbed it, the shift complete. The empire of loud confidence had been stripped down by composure and restraint. Daniel paused at the door, glanced back once, and exited, leaving a silence that spoke volumes. The executives exhaled collectively, some relieved, some contemplative. Elias's quiet justice hung in the air, a lesson in restraint, authority, and the power of unspoken truth. Daniel sank into the leather chair, the dim light of his living room casting long shadows across unopened letters and unanswered emails. His phone lay face down on the table, the screen dark, lifeless. For hours he had stared at it, waiting for the calls that never came, the messages that never appeared. He lifted it once, checked the notifications, and quickly set it down again. Nothing. The quiet pressed in, heavy and unrelenting. He ran a hand through his hair, leaning back, eyes flicking to the framed photo on the shelf, his daughter at graduation, smiling at a moment he hadn't shared. She hadn't called. She hadn't even visited. Pride and success had once meant everything. Now they seemed meaningless, almost absurd. I thought they'd care," he muttered to himself, voice low, fragile. The words hung in the air. A soft knock at the door startled him. He didn't answer. He didn't want to hear anyone's voice explaining what he already knew. Success had come loud and shiny, but its absence now was deafening. He stood and paced, running a hand along the windowsill, watching the neighborhood lights flicker. The world continued outside indifferent. "What did I build all this for?" he whispered. The leather chair, the expensive books, the half-empty wine bottles, all markers of a life that now felt hollow. He sank back into the chair, exhaling slowly. His reflection in the window stared back at him, a man stripped bare of applause, stripped bare of recognition. The silence was no longer just absence. It was judgment. It measured every mistake, every moment of cruelty, every arrogance that had once seemed insignificant. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, Daniel realized the emptiness he had ignored, the quiet that no amount of power could ever fill. He picked up the phone again. Nothing. He set it down. Quiet, final, relentless. Elias adjusted the strap of his bag as he stepped into the sunlit classroom. The walls were lined with colorful posters, maps, and students' artwork, reminders of growth, learning, and possibilities. Children moved between desks, their voices a gentle hum of curiosity and excitement. He paused near the doorway, letting their energy wash over him, a quiet contrast to the tension he had endured for years. "Good morning." "Everyone," Elias said, voice calm, carrying authority without harshness. A few heads looked up, smiles cautious, others confident. He walked slowly between the rows, letting his gaze meet each child's. "Today," he began, "we're going to learn something important. Respect. For yourself, for each other, for the people who came before you and the people who walk beside you now." A hand shot up. "Sir, is respect only for friends?" "No," he replied softly. "Respect is for everyone, even when it's hard. Even when someone tries to take it away. That's when it matters most." The children nodded, absorbing each word. One boy whispered to a friend, "He makes it sound like it's magic." Elias caught the glance, a small smile forming at the corners of his mouth. A teacher approached and asked, "Elias, how do you keep your calm with everything you've seen?" He paused, considering the question, then answered quietly, "Calm isn't weakness. It's understanding the cost of shouting when silence teaches more. When dignity leads, others follow, eventually. Sometimes the smallest voice is the loudest." The classroom shifted subtly, the students leaning in, the teacher watching with renewed respect. Elias guided a discussion on fairness and justice, not revenge. The questions came, the answers unfolded, and through it all, a quiet balance returned. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, a generation listened, laughed, and learned. A world once unkind had a small corner where justice felt tangible, standing not in fury but in composed presence. Elias exhaled, letting the moment linger. Victories, after all, did not need applause to exist.